very supportive, non-judgmental space. I want everybody in the comment section to input the last meal that they consumed today. So no judgment. I just want to kind of have a running understanding of kind of where everybody is.
Jesse, you might want to try and find a way to move presenter view, because I'm seeing that and it's in the middle of the screen. So I don't know if you could put that on one of your other screens maybe.
Yeah, the hardest part is being tech savvy. All right, can you see it now?
Perfect, yeah, you're good now.
All right, let me just kind of see what everybody's getting into. Tyler, 3 bags of Doritos and a pack of bacon. I'm just kidding. Damn, Steven, that's pretty meat heavy. Post run, Eco. I can't say that, Alice. Bulla, Benes, and some mango. I'll have to look that up. Okay. Strawberry, beef vermicelli. Happy birthday to your son, Jen. Fennel and tomato stew. Okay, got it. Thanks. All right, cool. So I appreciate everybody being here, and I know it's a little weird that I'm like turned to the left. I'll figure that out one day. So food allergies and food intolerances. We're going to kind of go through a little agenda of what this is going to look like today. So we're going to talk about the terminology of what actually is a food allergy versus food intolerance. And so some of these kind of operational definitions that we'll see kind of in this food intolerance and food allergy space. What are some of the statistics of children and adults dealing with this? And so, Jen, this might be particularly interesting because I'm going to touch on a lot of like infants and kind of kiddos in this presentation. We'll go through a very superficial kind of glance of immunology concepts, some symptoms, some ways that we see people diagnosing this, and then ways we can deal with this moving forward. If this stuff isn't taken care of, right, it can just present with like, oh, I get like a little watery eye every time I eat something. And this can present all the way into autoimmune conditions. So for certain people, this can be an incredibly important thing to focus on within how we individualize our nourishment plans. Okay. All right, so food allergies, about 3% of the population deals with this. So this is, if you guys have seen Hitch with Will Smith, there's a scene where he eats like, I don't know, some sort of shellfish, I think. And then he's like, his whole face kind of goes crazy and he's drinking a bottle of Robitussin. And I just remember the scene and he's all drunk on Robitussin. That's a full-blown food allergy where there is a mobilized immune response. So an adverse reaction to food where the system, the immune system is heavily involved. You can have false food allergies where it's a non-immunological mast cell stimulation through foods. You can also have food intolerances, which is what more people are likely going to present with on this conversation today, which is just really, it's like an overarching term, any adverse reaction to food where the involvement of the immune system isn't necessarily proven. Food sensitivity, that's more of like an umbrella term, right? So we can even say like, when I eat spicy wings, I have like a sensitivity because my eyes kind of water. And then food aversion, this is more of a psychological piece. I have, and this is actually in the DSM, the latest DSM, there are people who are picky eaters, and I forget what the actual like disease is, but people who are defined to eat 20 foods or less. I actually have 2 friends who will not eat more than 20 foods and have been like that their entire life. Really kind of interesting, but it's essentially like hamburgers and potatoes and like a couple of breads and stuff like that. Really kind of a fascinating thing when we understand just the differences in everybody's, food palette and kind of the foods that we find interesting and enjoyable. My story is I have dealt with food allergies and food intolerances. And so this is actually one of the more less severe times I got a food allergy. I would get a combination of food and a mutually inclusive situation where I had some sort of like stressor, like exercise. One time I took like a prescription pill and it presented with facial swelling, hives, itching, and it would feel like I had a cheeseburger stuck in my throat. And so there's nothing crazier than looking in the mirror and you're like, dang, I look good. And then 15 seconds later, you look in the mirror and you're like, I look like Shrek, or like I got run over by a bus. So super scary if that's never happened to you. Like, I don't care if something happens to my like arm or my torso, but when it happens to my face, like, I don't care what I have to take. I want to get rid of this immediately. So true food allergies, they're going to look something like this, or they're going to present for some sort of anaphylactic reaction. There's going to be a production of massive amounts of histamine. This is an adverse health effect arising from a specific immune response, and this can be reproduced with food. And for the sake of this conversation, just think there's a specific subclass of immunoglobulins, which are IgE, which is what is identified with food allergies. This is different than food intolerances, which are IgG reactions. Food intolerances, these are typically people have issues with like carbohydrates, so like lactose intolerance. It's a lot of times an enzyme deficiency or immune response that connects back to IgG antibodies, most likely due to leaky gut. So we're going to dive into leaky gut a little bit later on in this population. Probable range, according to research and Brossoff and Gamlin, is that this is roughly 10 to 25%, but there's an ascertainment bias where we really don't know how many people actually deal with food intolerances because it's tough to assess, and likely many people go their entire life without recognizing that they do have food intolerances. This is going to can affect anybody at any age, and the reaction can occur anywhere from like right after we eat food to about 72 hours. So we can have like a 3-day delayed onset. Wide range of symptoms, everything from like migraines to GI symptoms to actually presenting with autoimmune conditions. Food allergy history. This was first documented in Hippocrates, which is somewhere around like 400-ish BC. He injected a normal person with fish extract and then another person with a fish allergy with fish extract, and he was able to reproduce the allergic reaction. In 1966, we identified this as IgE was the antibody subclass that we were dealing with. Within children, it usually is acquired within the first 1 to 2 years of their life. About 6 to 8% of children actually deal with food allergies, but you'll hear that term that like, oh, you'll just kind of grow out of it. And people do tend to grow out of it, which is going to be interesting because we're going to talk about food intolerances and how we can do things to effectively grow out of some of these things, even as an adult. So over time, this drops off to maybe 1 to 2% in prevalence. Most food allergies are indeed lost, but when it comes to legumes and nuts, not so much. So it does vary the type of foods that we can grow out of. But it's also, we also need to understand that outgrowing food allergies connects with avoiding the offending food as much as possible if we have, a diagnosed food allergy. The big 8: cow's milk, eggs, legumes, mollusks, crustaceans, fish, wheat, and tree nuts. These account for 90% of allergies, and they're going to connect with food intolerances as well. You can see kind of a prevalence of food sensitivities. The interesting one for me was 0 to 2 years old, that you'll see like this is what a lot of kids are fed, like mushed up eggs, milk. Like my mom always was giving me bananas and mushed up peas and stuff. I'm like, this is kind of like a kid's diet. And then you can see as you go from 2 to 7, the prevalence of like a milk allergy seems to kind of go away. Eggs is still in there, right? This came out of a study in 1983. Plus some other common foods are gluten-containing products, casein, which is like the top form of like milk. It's like a slower digesting protein source. Certain food additives, like MSG, monosodium glutamate can be one of those. Tree nuts. But there's over 160 foods with documented allergic reactions within the literature. So have you ever heard of cross reaction? This is a really interesting with not just allergies, but also food intolerances as well. So for example, my wife's grandfather went in for a routine procedure and ended up passing away due to a latex allergy. We also know that a latex allergy is going to cross react with kind of some interesting things, but kiwi, bananas, and avocado, about 35% risk. We also have environmental allergens as well that can cross react. So just think ragweed, pretty similar to kind of cedar fever and oak. And that has cross reactivity to certain melons, zucchini, cucumbers, and bananas. I've also heard a couple of functional medicine practitioners say steak during when cedar fever, red meat when cedar fever is high can also potentially cross react, and some people as well. Another chart kind of showing a very similar thing. And so if I have one hill that I'll die on, it is this right here, is that individuals who have some form of seasonal allergies, like seasonal allergies, yes, they are a real thing. And one thing I want people to take away from this conversation today is that by avoiding our known food intolerances, we can dramatically improve the resiliency towards environmental allergens. And so it's going to take a much greater exposure of dust, pollen, mold to reach the threshold level and thus react to symptoms. So one more time, if we do not consume the foods which are weakening our immune systems, it takes a much greater exposure to dust, pollen, mold, etc., to reach our threshold levels and thus react with symptoms. So a lot of people deal with right now is oak allergies. If you see like the little green caterpillars with those little spider web things that I'm always running into, along with all of the green kind of pollen that's falling right now. That and cedar fever is what people in Central Texas are kind of struggling with right now. So when we start to remove some of those offending foods for people, and we'll kind of get to what some of those are, but to kind of touch on them, sugar, gluten-containing products, alcohol, dairy. These are some of the kind of bigger offenders that can really deplete our body's immune resiliency. And so when we start to lower the immune response by the foods, we actually increase our tolerance to handling some of these seasonal allergies. And in personal practice, why do I care about this? I care less about people having the allergies, and I care more about it interrupting people's consistency within training. So some people just struggle so much, and they literally have such a hard time breathing that they can't train. And so if we address their nourishment profile, I can get them to consistently train, week after week after week without having these issues. And some people, literally it changes their life, right? They develop the awareness of like, oh, okay, I really need to watch my alcohol intake and my bread intake during times of high seasonal allergies. And when I do so, I notice that I have a lot greater resiliency to these outdoor allergies. 25% of infants lose all food allergy symptoms after one age. So again, we can kind of grow out of these things. And most kiddos will kind of grow out of their milk allergy by about 3 years. So we kind of see that there's a decrease in age when we're kind of growing out of milk allergies. Same with respiratory allergies as well. Here's another kind of prevalence chart. Milk is kind of one of the bigger offenders for young children. Then we have eggs, peanuts, tree nuts, fish, shellfish, and other. There are a lot more infants who struggle with food allergies than adults. So again, kind of brings up the, this is from another study from an allergy clinic. another thing that kind of supports that we grow out of this for the most part. We have many defense mechanisms for fighting off infectious diseases and other foreign substances. And a strong, healthy immune system can mobilize and respond to different sorts of environmental allergens and infectious diseases. But this is all modulated by our genetics, our race, our lifestyle, how we're moving every day, how much we're sleeping, the amount of stress that we take on. If you guys are familiar with the Central Athletes BLGs, right? Getting sunlight, getting movement, drinking water, curating kind of a nutritional approach. These are things that can boost our immune resiliency and really make it so it's just harder for us to get affected negatively by different things being passed around. The GI tract forms a barrier to the outside environment. So something called gut-associated lymphoid tissue is what responds to non-dangerous antigens while mounting responses to pathogenic substances. Intact food antigens may penetrate the GI tract, but not cause like severe clinical symptoms. This is what's known as leaky gut that we're going to get into in a touch. We have specific and non-specific defenses. So specific defenses are, just think of if I had coronavirus and I survived, I likely would have the antibody, which would then protect me moving forward from coronavirus. We also have non-specific defenses, right? So I have things like my saliva and mucus. I have my skin. I have something called the interferon system. I have, again, you know, this isn't something that's widely accepted with conventional wisdom, but also fever, right? Think about fever. A fever can have antibacterial and antiviral properties, okay? So if a pathogen does well at 98.6 degrees, but then it does terribly at 101 degrees and might not die, right? The body has had hundreds of thousands, millions of years where we have developed inflammatory responses, a fever response, right? Snotting and sneezing, right? These are all my 5 emunctories help me excrete things out of my body. And so it's a rather interesting thing just to think of, and I don't necessarily want to dive down this rabbit hole, but it's interesting to think that, you know, my 21st century brain knows better than what my body evolved to do through hundreds of thousands of millions of years, right? So I'm sick. I'm just going to, you know, I'm snotting, I have a runny nose. I'm just going to take something and kind of suppress that and keep it into my body. I have a fever. I'm going to take an Advil so I don't get the fever. So we're kind of interrupting what our body is naturally doing. So it's just kind of an interesting thing to think about, that we have non-specific defenses that may be the best medicine for certain pathogens that I might pick up. This is kind of just a chart that kind of breaks down what I was just talking about. And then this goes into different immunoglobulin subclasses. So really the primary ones that we're talking about are IgG and IgE. IgE is what we're talking about with food allergies. IgG is what we're talking about primarily with food intolerances. Right, types of allergies, we can have like an immediate hypersensitivity. Right now I've had about 8 of these. And so one time I was like feeling a little funky and I was like, I'm gonna go work out. And I was completely fine. And I went upside down into a handstand and I did 15 handstand push-ups. And then I got back up and I turned around to my friend and my friend was like, oh my God. My face in 15 seconds had turned into that person on Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, that like blueberry girl. And I was like grotesque. And that's happened multiple times. And so I've been to a lot of like immunologists and allergists and trying to figure out, I've done food intolerance testing, allergy testing. So I've had a lot of kind of interesting experiences with this. You can also have a delayed hypersensitivity. Something greater than 8 hours. Typically, you don't see that present as much. You typically see this start to, you know, delayed onset stuff start to affect more from like a food intolerance perspective. Multiple different systems can be affected here: skin, joint, respiratory, brain, immune, blood, fatigue, weight loss, compromised immune system, autoimmune disease, cancer, thyroid conditions, decreased bone mineral density, reproductive system dysfunction, neurological and psychiatric disorders. This kind of breaks down food allergy versus food intolerance, and then kind of different types of food intolerances. So we can have a metabolic food intolerance. So I have an issue with the lactase enzyme and I'm lactose intolerant. Right? I'm not going to name names, but I had a particular client who decided to overconsume caffeine before one of her priority runs recently. And she has a pharmacological aversion to coffee. Right? There can be other idiopathic or kind of undefined responses to food as well, which we kind of just break down into these other categories. I was looking up food addiction, and I just wanted to put this on the slide. This is somebody being restrained from some cheeseburgers, and I thought it was funny. There's an interesting kind of thing that we see often, and it's very, very similar to like an alcoholic, right? Where we crave a specific substance, and for a short period of time, it actually makes us feel better. And then when we don't have that food or substance, we feel worse. So some people are like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine a world without bread. And then they don't eat it and they almost feel like crap. And then they eat it and they're like, oh, I feel so, so good. So individuals with food sensitivities, they frequently behave as if they're addicted to foods, kind of like an addict. The sensitivity reaction may stop or decrease with the second feeding in the same way a cocaine addict's unpleasant withdrawal symptoms are alleviated by snort of cocaine or an alcoholic by another drink. As a result, many patients often crave foods that cause their symptoms. So this is kind of this conundrum where people are like, I feel so good eating this food. And then sometimes I have to be like, nevertheless, I'm going to ask you to kind of trust me here. And I want you to like take a little breather from this. And then we're going to reintroduce it. And a lot of times when we do an effective elimination and reintroduction protocol, they're actually like, holy crap, I feel amazing. And then they completely tank when they eat that food again. So it's kind of a counterintuitive thing that we see present often. We've all heard of endorphins, but there are also something called exorphins, which are foods that are broken down through digestive enzymes, which can mimic endorphins. So this kind of is like the mechanistic thing to understand as it relates to why we might feel like a high from certain food. I mean, we all understand sugar and how sugar promotes kind of like this high that we have, but it can be from things like milk, wheat, maize, barley, several things. Food intolerances. These may develop because of poor digestion, dysbiosis, which is an imbalance in the gut flora, candida, parasites, intestinal infections, poorly balanced diet, alcohol, drugs, pharmaceuticals, medications. And one thing to remember is that the gut is the largest immune organ, containing over 60% of the cell's mass. So a lot of times people say that, you know, our gut is so connected to our immune system. So a lot of times if you're trying to impact somebody's immune system, you want to also start to take a look at the gut. It's a very much a complex relationship though between adverse food reactions and hyperpermeability of the intestinal lining and the lining of the stomach. So things that can affect our intestinal microecosystem. We probably have all heard that antibiotics are like great, but also it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? Because we have antibiotics, it's honestly what allows a lot of us to live without passing away of certain infections. I was reading a book recently called The Indifferent Stars Above, and it was about these settlers around 1846, and they went through this harrowing time trying to cross the Sierra Nevadas in the middle of winter. It was like 96 of them, and most of them perished. And one of the guys, this is a true story, he's trying to fix his wagon, and he accidentally just like stabs himself kind of superficially with his knife. Well, by the end of this thing, right, he spends like 4 months, you know, like without provisions, and essentially he's like starving, and his arm, like his entire arm like balloons up, and the infection starts to go to the rest of his body. And I believe he passes away just from a simple infection that he wasn't able to ward off. So antibiotics are such a beautiful thing, but right, when we're killing the pathogenic bacteria, we're also killing the good bacteria as well. So antibiotics is something to understand how it affects, you know, this intestinal ecosystem, but also our diet, having chronic diarrhea, stress, different types of infections. These are all things that can impact kind of our gut ecosystem. Small intestinal bacteria overgrowth. This can not be a great thing, and it can be kind of tough to treat for some people. Some of the causes of this are linked to low stomach acid. I personally, along with some of the food allergies and intolerances, I had heartburn for years and years and years. And if you've never had heartburn, it is probably one of the most uncomfortable, but like, it's kind of like a paper cut, like nobody's going to cry about a paper cut, but paper cut can be pretty annoying. And so it's just this like constant kind of irritation, and you can feel it. And I would get like 50 or 60 kind of surges of like acid kind of coming up. And so I got to the point where I was eating a bottle of Tums per day, and I was just popping pills. And so I went to the doctor and I took a pill, didn't work, tried another pill, didn't work. And eventually he prescribed Nexium. And Nexium was like the most beautiful drug for me. It literally took me from like suffering every single day to I had like a 99.7% alleviation of all my symptoms. I take it for 10 years and I notice that I have constant diarrhea, and I have some of these other effects. And I start testing my blood work. I start testing other things. And I realize how much it's lowered my stomach acid. And long-term studies that we now know about proton pump inhibitors, which is a class of drugs that Nexium is, it starts to lead towards things with, I'm going to mess this up, but I believe it's a couple of micronutrient and mineral deficiencies like B12, magnesium, potentially zinc, along with bone mineral density issues played out long-term, right? So if we start to play with one thing, there's going to be downstream effects. So this reductionist view of medicine sometimes can be beautiful. In my case, I didn't have any pain anymore, but I paid the price of admission, and I had to spend years kind of working back towards what I would consider health. So hypochlorhydria is just low stomach acid. Crohn's disease is also a cause of small bacterial overgrowth. Diabetes, chronic pancreatitis, giardia, malnutrition, reduced motility, really in anybody, just think constipation. But if you have bowel dysfunction, you can't just treat one thing. You don't just treat food allergies. You have to kind of look at the complete picture. So likely if you have food allergies, you most likely have unbalanced ratio of good to bad bacteria in your gut, as well as some hyperpermeability issues within the lining of your intestines. Dysbiosis is essentially an imbalance of pathogenic microorganisms. The bad stuff outnumbers the good stuff. Things that can lead to this, like we discussed, antibiotics, stress, digestion issues. So some of us have talked about proper food hygiene. So sitting down, relaxing, putting our utensils down before we eat, slowing down, chewing our food, masticating until it has a consistency of baby food. These are all things that can be helpful for dysbiosis. Another kind of interesting anecdote, my dad took all of the home videos, digitized them, uploaded them to Dropbox, which is crazy to see your life like just 25 years in the past. And I was this like, go, super ADHD kid. And my mom's like, come on, get dinner. And I would run in and like shove something in my face, and I'd like run out. And I literally saw myself like eat like an entire bowl of pasta when I was like 8 years old in like, I would say like a minute and a half. Like it was disgusting. And so I'm like, man, I totally get why I had all these issues growing up. Like there's no like guess in my mind why I had, heartburn and some of these things I've kind of talked about. Radiation, alcohol, surgery, like alcohol just literally, a lot of you guys know my stance on booze. It just, it erodes the lining of the gut. It promotes dysbiosis. We make shitty decisions. We spend more money, extra calories. We have to detoxify it. We have a badass night a lot of times, but there's just so many repercussions of booze. Aging, stress, poor diet, these all lead to dysbiosis as well. This is kind of a blurry image, but it was a kind of a good image of the amount of bacteria that are in different parts of our GI system. So our stomach has a certain amount, then our, I'm not going to Jejunium. Petty, you could probably help me with that name since you have a little bit of a background there. Has a little bit more, and then your ileum, colon, large intestine, the small intestine, and has a lot more bacteria. Interplay between medicine and microbes, right? Antibiotics is going to crush it. Things like chemotherapy drugs, they're really going to modulate, how it's going to affect the stomach acid, microorganisms in our gut. So another kind of more complex image here, but intestinal barrier dysfunction can lead to food allergies and food intolerances, which can increase our likelihood to have immune system abnormalities, which can potentially lead to autoimmune conditions. These are all the things that can have an effect on the gut microbiome. So one thing we'll talk about is kind of preconception to birth. So if you guys actually would be interested in seeing this, if you guys don't mind, and if you don't know, I want you to type this in as well, but I want to know how everybody was born. So were you born like vaginally? Were you born via C-section? I think those are the two options. There might be a third that I'm not thinking of. But this can play into, and this is part of our assessment process here at Central Athlete, is I want to understand how somebody was raised. And then the second question I have for each of you, and if you don't know this, you guys have homework. I want you each to call your mothers later on today and ask them, were you breastfed and for how long? Or were you formula fed and then at what age? My mom, for example, my grandma Mima, her brother died in the Korean War about 11 days after my mom was born. And so the stress dried up all of my grandma's milk. And so at day 11, my mom was formula fed. And so besides, how it affects our gut microbiome, and I know it's I don't want to really get into the politics of this or anything, but what we have seen demonstrated in epidemiological research is that breastfed babies on average are 8.8 IQ points more intelligent than formula-fed babies. So not only relating to our gut microbiome, it also relates to kind of the development of the human being. The running thesis is that they likely do better due to the DHA content from the mother that's found within breast milk. So if you notice now, formula is fortified with DHA and other fatty acids to kind of help with that. So, right, C-sections can wreak havoc on the gut microbiome, stress, excessive hygiene. Really kind of interesting point when we look at epidemiological research of how people growing up on farms versus urban environments, we see the people who grew up on farms have a much greater resiliency to colds, infections, flus, things of that nature. And when we analyze people who grew up on a farm versus in an urban environment, we see drastically different compositions of their gut microflora. So kind of an interesting piece. Physical inactivity, insufficient sleep, exposure to harmful substances. These can all kind of have an effect on our gut microbiome. Common associate, symptoms and conditions. I'm not going to say everything here. Again, if you want any of these notes for further reference, I can send this out to you. And again, these aren't like some dude who's kind of writing some things down. This is all evidence-based. So this all comes from literature, and there is some sort of piece of evidence that connects some of these things back to dysbiosis. Dysbiosis creates conditions that promote leaky gut and food allergies. So how do we evaluate that? One of the ways, and I'm actually, I'll spare you the details of how this is procured, but a CDSA is where we can analyze what is actually in our gut microflora. Some people, especially people who have traveled or been in unsanitary conditions for long periods of times, potentially have different pathogenic things in their bodies living. Specifically, parasites can be one of those things. This was a parasitology test. I don't know if this is actually true, but I heard on The Wizard of Oz, the lead actress actually got really skinny. And I have no clue if this is true, so don't hold me to this. I believe she either purposely or non-purposely had a parasite to maintain her physique for that role within The Wizard of Oz. So I guess it can be good for losing weight, but it can have other downstream effects as well. If we're looking at gut dysbiosis, how do we treat and prevent this? So sugar is one of the biggest things. Pathogenic bacteria, a lot of times their preferred fuel source is going to be glucose. And so if we feed them a bunch of refined carbohydrates or sugar, that's going to just help them proliferate and grow. From a treatment perspective, you know, kind of the running model that's out there right now is remove, replace, re-inoculate, and repair. We want to remove any sort of pathogenic things in the system. We want to replace, you know, in my case, I needed to beef up hydrochloric acid, re-inoculate. So there's all sorts of different types of probiotics that have different functions on the nervous system, on the brain, on the immune system, yada, yada, yada. And then repair. We want to prebiotics, diet, supplements, you know, if we need to repair the lining of gut. This is kind of how we, the running functional model of how we treat this and further prevent it down the road. Also dietary change, right? I listed a lot of these things: antifungals, antibacterials. These can be some other things to treat as well. Leaky gut. The premise behind leaky gut is when there is some in the lining of our intestines, there are these kind of tight junctions, and over time, when we do certain things, we can essentially kind of create some hyperpermeability. So it allows food particulates to kind of seep through here. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing, although it can be a bad thing when our immune system is involved. And so our immune system may potentially see some of these food particulates come in and then start to tag those things as and mobilize an antibody response. It occurs as a result of food allergies, dysbiosis, inflammation, nutrient insufficiencies, and it really heavily contributes towards food allergies and food sensitivities. So there's some assessment things that can be done here to understand where we, you know, if somebody has this. So this particular patient had severe leaky gut, and then you can kind of see based upon this test and how the restored function, they were able to restore health, and they were able to do that and verify that, I guess, via this test. So what can we do if we think we have adequate digestion, or if we potentially have leaky gut? Promote adequate digestion. So food hygiene is a big piece of it. Remove offending foods. A lot of times, you know, I can make some blanket statements here and say things like gluten, alcohol, sugar. Maybe they don't relate, maybe they do relate, but they're definitely not building health. So at least for a period of time, removing some of these things out of the diet can be a great thing to do. And then also certain nutrients like vitamin A, zinc, folic acid, glutamine can all be very, very helpful. Glutamine specifically is very helpful for repairing the lining of the gut. And then there's also nutraceuticals. Slippery elm bark is another interesting one, which is essentially like this, what was that thing? Like Slimer, what was he in? The Ghostbusters, right? So he would leave that trail of slime around. So slippery elm bark is like this like slimy type substance, and you drink it, and it almost like coats your whole like upper GI system. It can be a really, really great thing for people who have maybe a tendency towards like Barrett's esophagus, or they've had heartburn for years and years. Really kind of interesting substance. Intestinal lining and the erosion of it can really be coupled with poorly digested foods, and it'll start to allow large proteins and food particulates to seep through the protective layers of the gut. This is where an immune response is potentially mobilized, and antigens come in there, and antibodies are mobilized against them. Some disorders, we got eczema, asthma, MS, seasonal allergies. I'm gonna go for it. Sjogren's syndrome, yeah. Otis media, which I believe is ear infections, depression, ADHD, behavioral issues with kiddos, type 1, type 2 diabetes. How are food allergies diagnosed? You got physician, right? Medical history, skin tests, lab tests, oral food challenge. double-blind food challenge, and my favorite one and the gold standard is an elimination protocol. So even beyond all of the, and I actually got yelled at for Shayna when I made this presentation. It was actually over 100 slides long, and I went into every single type of testing. I got a little carried away, but you have like a mediator release test, LCAT, IgE, IgG, IgE, IgD. You have all these variants of different types of tests and a lot of like proprietary tests. The elimination diet is still the gold standard here. We also, not going to go into that. Elimination and reintroduction protocol. So in a perfect world, we recommend a minimum of like 7 to 10 days, but in a perfect world, just from clinical experience, 6 weeks is the most opportune time to do an elimination protocol. So some diets you can kind of look up is I can't say my own stuff. Oligo antigenic diet along with the elemental diet. Or just if you Google autoimmune paleo diet, these are all elimination protocols where essentially they're pulling out most known food allergens. You eat that literally 100% of the time for whatever time you commit to, but the gold standard would be 6 weeks. And then you reintroduce with multiple types of challenges. So for example, if I suspect Tyler has dairy issues, which I am like, I'm convinced he might have a little milk allergy there, I would put Tyler through a 6-week elimination protocol. And then on that week 7, day 1, I'm going to slam him with dairy. He's going full fat dairy for breakfast. For lunch, he's going to go like a quart of like Greek yogurt, and then he's going ice cream in dinner time. And then I don't challenge him anymore. And I have him journal his reaction to those foods. And a lot of times it's like, I guess my best analogy is like, if I kind of get like slapped in the face every day, I'm like, oh yeah, I can kind of get used to that, and it's not a big deal. And then I haven't been slapped in a while, I get knocked. I'm like, wow, that really, I noticed that. That's kind of the analogy with a elimination reintroduction protocol. It's like over time, we kind of get like, man, my cheek is getting red. We get used to getting kind of hit in the face. But if we haven't been hit in the face in a while, it kind of wakes us up and we create awareness around that. Low salicylate, that's, something that's salicylic acid is something that's found in vegetables. Some people have some vegetable digestion issues. We want to obtain a baseline on the front end of the elimination diet. So we want to understand kind of what people are currently experiencing. We need complete avoidance of certain foods. So a lot of times this is just, we need to assess the level of motivation that a particular client has here. So if they kind of don't eat ice cream for 6 weeks, then it may not be as effective of a test. The reason why an elimination protocol isn't a standard practice is due to terribly low compliance. I mean, I believe, I forget the exact statistics, but I believe like life-saving medication, like taking like a HIV pill every day, like the compliance is something like 60 to 70%. And that's just popping a pill every day. I'm trying to get somebody to like avoid almost every single food for 6 weeks. It's a very challenging thing, even for the most diligent and dialed in people. This kind of talks about the food challenge techniques that I talked about. If there's no change in target parameters, then you just return to your normal diet all at once. If improvement is observed, then you're going to just introduce food singly. So meaning one at a time, every like 1 to 2 days or so. Like I said, multiple challenges for each food, and just note that there are delayed reactions. So anything from like an immediate reaction to a delayed onset reaction of maybe 72 hours. Infant allergies, right? We want to potentially predict. So does the mother or does the father have any sort of food intolerance or food allergy? If we had some practices like say mother's milk dried up and I had to give a C-section, there is epidemiological research to support that they might have more of a propensity towards having some sort of sensitization to a potentially atopic substance. Atopic really just means that it doesn't, the allergen doesn't connect with what's the best way to say it? So like an atopic reaction is like if I have like poison ivy and I touch the poison ivy, I get it right here in my arm. Atopy means that I get it not where it was touched or not how I interacted with it. There's multiple ways to identify if somebody has a food intolerance or food allergy. We talked about some of those ways before, and then there's a lot of ways to manage it. But one of the best ways is to avoid said substance once you know what it is. If you've heard me talk before, I'm a huge proponent of probiotics. This is one of the studies that I pulled. So Lactobacillus, it's a specific strain of probiotics, was given to high-risk mothers in the last 2 weeks of their pregnancy and for 6 months after their birth to their offspring. And what they noticed was atopic eczema at 2 years. There was a 46% chance of atopic eczema for the control group. And then there's a reduction to about 23% with the lactobacillus group. All babies should receive probiotics, in my opinion. I think that the evidence is overwhelming. This is just one piece of it. And I'm such a firm believer that I believe that probiotics should be given preconception all the way to the death of that individual. The reason being is that 60% of all cultures around the world eat probiotic-rich foods. We are not one of them. We are in a uber ultra sterilized world where there's a lot of benefits to sterilization, right? I'm gonna, not pass along potential pathogenic stuff to other people. Very, very important. But also we're killing a lot of those good bacteria that can have a positive impact on my body. You can eat probiotic-rich foods like kimchi or sauerkraut or some of the most easily understood. But that can be a very, very great thing to help naturally getting probiotics in our bodies. Some other ways to prevent food allergies in infants, we talked about DHA and its importance, is trying to get to half a teaspoon of DHA within the kiddo per day by about 6 months of age. Water, castor oil in their tummies, reading and talking to the baby, and then also creating a calm, relaxed state for the baby as often as possible so they can optimally develop. These all will feed into the expression or lack of expression of food intolerances and food allergies. If you have an acute reaction, vitamin C in a glass of water can be, or like Alka-Seltzer can be really great for an acute reaction. We're going to get into some supplemental things we can do: intestinal repair, nutritional counseling, and then BLGs. Sunshine, movement, nutrition, sleep, stress, hydration. All these things are very, very important. Supplements, I would just, for this type of stuff, I almost debated whether or not I get into this and put it on here, but I do think this is something to touch on. I always like, even myself included, to work with a practitioner who knows way more than myself. These are some things that can help with the immune system and food intolerances. Everything from like, Juglans regia, ribase nigrum. These are all botanicals, different sort of vitamin minerals. We talked about probiotics. Another interesting piece about probiotics is that 60% of our stools are actually probiotics. Really kind of an interesting piece that I didn't realize, so I was doing a lot of this research. The main function of probiotics is not to replace the lost flora, but to seed the Peyer's patches, which increase our immune response. The Peyer's patches are these pieces of like lymphatic tissue in the ileum, and it has a robust response on how it affects our immune system. I really like, there's a Canadian brand, or I guess I'll back up. There's 4 criteria for probiotics that I look for personally. It needs to have proven product shelf life stability, ensuring that the actual probiotics are going to reach me with the correct potency. So if you buy a lot of probiotics at the store, or if they don't have strict manufacturing guidelines and say you have a probiotic that needs to be 44 to 66 degrees for it to be stable and to live, and then it's sitting in a hot Amazon warehouse for 6 months, you just bought $100 of probiotics and you're literally wasting every single dollar. So this is one of the ones where I really am pushy about medical grade supplements bought through a verified distributor. So proven product shelf life stability. It's got the ability of the selected cultures survive gastric juices and its acidity of my stomach. the ability of the culture to attach to the epithelial tissue, and then it's also proven in trials. So there's a Canadian brand called Soroil or Genestra, and they have 20 years of clinical studies that demonstrate the efficacy of their HMF brand probiotics. Most probiotics are milk-based, and as such, they're not super specific for the human gut. So I prefer, this is just one brand that I thought was great. EpiPen, another funny anecdote. I was having an allergic reaction in college, and it was like the third one that I was having. And so I was just loaded up on EpiPens, and it was happening, and I was like, man, I got that cheeseburger stuck in my throat that's feeling again. And I was telling this to my roommate at the time, John Carter, and I got the EpiPen, and I was like sitting there, and I was about to, like, if you guys don't know what an EpiPen is, it's essentially like the spring-loaded like shot, and you like go like this. And I was like, and I like couldn't get myself to do it. And I felt the reaction coming on strong, and we were about to go to an art show of all random things we were going to do in college. We're super excited about it. So I was like, John, you got to EpiPen me, and you got to do it in my leg. And I have never seen a human being smile so big as that moment when I handed him the EpiPen, and he just cranked up as high as he could, and he hit me so hard with it. And it was a crazy response. Within like 20, 30 seconds, I was like, whoa, I felt inherently different. And it didn't hurt too bad. Like he hit me so dang hard, like the punch of it hurt more than the needle entering my thigh. But I'll never, literally till the day I die, I'll never will forget John Carter EpiPenning me in my 5th year of college right before an art show. Typically we want to do that when we have an anaphylactic reaction. One thing that people forget about EpiPens is that I don't even understand this, but they're only stable for like 6 months. And so you have to carry it everywhere. You have to keep buying them. Every time I bought an EpiPen, it was like a couple $100s. And so it's a very important thing, but you also want to make sure that you have one that is like at the right temperature. Like you can't keep them in your car when it's 100 degrees outside in Texas. So you got to think about those things. Summary. Understanding and identifying food intolerances will significantly help you with your journey towards health, endurance, stamina. Some people, things I've seen in clinical experience is I've seen people have dramatic losses of weight. I've seen people go from inconsistent to consistently being able to train because they no longer were being slammed by seasonal allergies. It took them to where they were practically like having to stay at home and stay inside, to where they're able to go outside, and they might get like an occasional like watery eye and stuff like that, but it completely presented in a much more favorable way. If you want the slides, I can send these to anybody, but using the selected tools to identify specific foods which you might have issues to, but go towards some of the big ones, sugar, alcohol, grains, nuts. Those are a lot of the bigger triggers. You follow the BLGs, that'll help boost immune resiliency. And then with a qualified practitioner, supplementation can be something that can be very, very helpful to help to restore your gastrointestinal health. It can recreate homeostasis within your GI system, the endocrine system. So these can all be very, very helpful things. And this was man, I got real mad at me the other day because I got the sudden urge to buy a new house. Like one day there was this house on the street. I'm like, I love that house. So this was us at the new house. And I was like, hey, this is our new house. Let's take a picture. And I love this expression of River. So y'all can see a little picture of River's confused, like, hey, I just woke up face. So I thought y'all would like that. But anyway, I'm gonna look at some of these, the chat box, and maybe Shayna, if there's any kind of, I'd love if there's any questions or thoughts or ideas. I know I just slammed through that thing through this presentation. So if there's any thoughts or questions, I'd love to hear them as I.
Yeah, the one that came through earlier was about how race also plays into food intolerances.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of my perspectives with food is that we have to zoom out and understand what our ancestors ate. And then I want to understand what you ate growing up. And then I want to understand what you ate about 2 weeks ago. All of these three things can be helpful in understanding kind of your resiliency to certain foods. So to answer the question about race, if we go back, you know, anywhere from like 30 to 60,000 years ago, I would be curious as to where the ancestry came from, because what we know is that African Americans and Asians do have a harder time, for example, metabolizing lactose, right? And so there's going to be more of a propensity for them to have issues with that nightly ice cream habit or drinking some milk and stuff like that. That's kind of the first thing that kind of comes to mind. So yeah, race definitely does matter. And just think about how long have I been eating a certain thing. If you've been eating a certain thing for hundreds of thousands of years, you've likely adapted and have resiliency to said food. But just think about when we introduced like booze to the Native Americans and like the Inuit Indians, it's like kind of wreaked havoc on their society. They have, I don't know if you want to call it like, it may be more of a sensitivity than like an intolerance, but from like I don't know, like a cultural perspective or behavioral perspective, they can't seem to handle it very well. So maybe not an immune response, but they don't handle it really well at all.
And the other question is the name of the probiotic you recommend.
So Ceroil or Genestra, it's a kind of a combination, and it's their brand HMF. I think it's like, it stands for Human Microflora. And there's multiple different types. So there's like HMF Intensive 50, there's HMF Intensive 500, there's HMF Baby B, HMF Baby F. There's literally 20 to 25 different ones. And so I can help anybody if you're looking for a specific recommendation. There's also different like price points and different research that connects with each one, but I can kind of help guide anybody who's curious about that.
Awesome. If there are no other questions, I'll stop the recording and wrap this up. And I mentioned earlier in the chat, but I am working on, hopefully this week, getting all of these past presentations, the slides, and the actual recording up on our website. So I'm just working with our web folks on getting that set up. So hopefully that will happen this week. But if you absolutely cannot wait until that happens, just shoot me or Jesse a message, and we'll go ahead and send over the recording and slides.
Boom. Thank you guys
for
listening to me for an hour. Good stuff.